Hello and welcome back to the podcast. Today I'm going to do an episode that's all about choice and feeling like we don't have a choice, which is a not uncommon feeling amongst people pleasers. And what prompted me to think about this episode was really the whole thing around me doing a podcast and getting the episodes out there and almost feeling like I didn't have a choice as to whether or not I took a break from it initially. And it wasn't until I noticed what was going on for myself and tuned into it that I was like, no, I do have a choice. Like, it's my decision if I decide to have a break or not. And then it just got me thinking about how, as people pleasers, we do often go about almost automatically in life, often feeling like we have no choice when it comes to certain things, because that's such an ingrained feeling a lot of the time. It means that we miss those opportunities where perhaps there is an option for us to do something different. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today's episode, all about choice. So if you've ever felt trapped by the expectations of other people, perhaps, or like you have to say yes or go along with what's being asked of you, then this episode is for you. And this feeling of not having a choice ties in with that moment when often we want to say no or we want to set a boundary, but it just feels impossible. It's like the world, like something awful is really going to happen if we dare to sort of stand up for ourselves or say how we feel. What also made me reflect on this was when we had the recent bad snowy conditions where I lived. And even just seeing the forecast made me have this overwhelming sense of anxiety at the thought of having to drive somewhere. And even when the roads were gritted and there wasn't any ice left and the snow had almost gone, I still found myself worrying and feeling really like disproportionate level of anxiety about it. So that led me to take a moment to check in with myself, and I just noticed what was happening in my body. And it might sound strange if you're not familiar with implicit memories, which are those memories stored in the body outside our conscious awareness. But I closed my eyes and I asked myself, like, where's this coming from? What might my body be remembering about this? And then it hit me, like, no wonder I felt anxious, because I remember years ago when I was employed, I was literally driving to work in the most horrendous conditions because I felt like I had no choice. It didn't even cross my mind that there was an option of not going. You know, I'm not talking a light dusting of snow. I'm talking like it was awful, like more than one time as well that I remembered. So when I closed my eyes and asked my body what it was remembering, these images popped up. These memories of times where, I'd skidded down a hill and nearly went into a lamppost, or I remembered seeing a bus stranded in what was like a snowstorm after sliding into a wall. There was all sorts of different associations that I had with it. These conditions were genuinely dangerous. But it's almost like back then, I didn't feel like I could trust my judgment. It felt like I didn't even know if I was fully justified in, for example, like ringing up work and saying, oh, I can't come in today. I can't drive. At that time, it didn't even cross my mind that that was an option. It's mad, isn't it, when you think about it? But if you're listening and you are prone to people pleasing, perhaps this resonates with you as well. It's crazy in one respect, but it's also really understandable from the psychological perspective, how we can be so conditioned to override our own needs and that we don't even see that there's choices in front of us a lot of the time. And the reason I'm sharing this is because I really want to invite you to start noticing where in your life do you feel like you don't have a choice? And what if there were more options available to you than you realise? How would that look? So I'll touch on where these beliefs come from in the first place, how it might show up for you, and most importantly, how you can start to see that a lot of the time you do have a choice, even though it might feel like you don't. So the feeling that you don't have a choice often goes back to early experiences, whether that's societal conditioning, the messages you've received implicitly or explicitly growing up, or even trauma. So if you grew up in an environment where your needs weren't prioritised, intentionally or not, you might have learned early on that other people's feelings or expectations mattered more than your own. So maybe you were told, to be a good girl and do as you're told, or you were praised all the time when you were helpful and when you were compliant, and you didn't quite get the positive regard when you weren't being helpful or compliant. And over time, you internalize that idea that to be accepted or loved, you had to be agreeable and you had to do what was expected. That was the right thing to do. That's what made you good. You might also have learned that keeping others happy was the safest way for you to navigate relationships. So for some of us, this conditioning goes even deeper into our nervous system. If you've experienced traumatic things, and remember, trauma isn't just the presence of bad things, it's also can be a result of the absence of the good stuff as well. And you may have developed from that a survival response known as fawning. And fawning is when you instinctively appease others to keep the peace and avoid conflict. And you prioritize their needs over your own in order to stay safe and to feel safe. And it can leave you feeling powerless, like you have to do what's expected of you to avoid the rejection or avoid confrontation or even to avoid emotional abandonment. At one point, that response was protective. It's like an ingenious survival strategy. If it kept you safe from situations where you knew standing up for yourself felt too risky or was too risky because maybe you'd be punished in some way or love would be withdrawn via the silent treatment. But as adults, when we've not processed and addressed the root cause of the fawn response, the brain struggles to recognize that the here and now in terms of being the adult, it fails to recognize that it's different from back there and then when we were a child, and it can leave us feeling trapped. We really feel in those moments that we have no choice but to keep putting others first, even when it's at our own expense. And then with that as well, then there's the broader conditioning as well of where it can come from. So many of us were taught that saying no or putting ourselves first is selfish or it's rude. And women in particular are often socialized to be caregivers, to be this, endlessly accommodating, to not rock the boat, to prioritize harmony over their own needs. Otherwise, we're being difficult or hysterical or whatever you want to call it. And those messages become so deeply ingrained that they don't even feel like conditioning anymore. They feel like the truth. Like there's no other option but to go along with what's expected. But that's not the truth. And that's what I'm going to talk about, because recognizing that you do have a choice is the first step to breaking free from those patterns that show up for you that make you feel like you have none. And as adults, these patterns can play out in so many ways. So I'll share a few examples that might sound familiar. So in work situations, you might feel like you have to say yes to every request from your manager. If you're asked to stay late despite your contract saying you should finish at 5, or if you get a call for help from a colleague, like you feel like you have to say yes or you have to help them. And even last minute requests, ones that might mean that you're sacrificing your weekend, for example, it doesn't feel like something you can turn down. Saying no might feel unthinkable because you're worried about being seen as unreliable or you fear letting people down. And the idea of pushing back then feels impossible, like you're going to be seen as lazy or difficult or a bad person. But sometimes you don't even get to the thought of even considering saying no because yes is just this automatic response that it doesn't even register that there might be an alternative option. And in personal relationships, you might find yourself agreeing to plans you don't want to go to because you don't want to upset anyone, or you say yes to things even when they don't feel right for you because you feel like you have to. And maybe you stay silent about things that bother you. You might always be the responsible one, the one who seems to do the most around the house, the one who friends always turn to for support, yet you feel like no one cares for you in the same way. No one seems to consider or care for you in the same way. No one's showing up for you in the way that you show up for them. And it can feel like you don't have a choice because at some point in your life, you were taught that prioritizing others over yourself is just what you do. And so you feel stuck. And as I touched on with my driving in the snow example, this feeling of having no choice can show up in the smallest of everyday situations. Maybe you take on extra tasks at home even though you're exhausted, or you agree to give someone a lift even when you really don't want to and they live 10 miles in the opposite direction. These things all come with that heavy sense of obligation that it's just what you do. You have to do it. And because it feels so true that you don't have a choice, you might go through the motions on autopilot, reinforcing that belief without even realizing it. And even when rationally you know that you do have a choice. And these behaviours are often driven by deeply rooted fears of rejection, failure, or even being seen as selfish. And they're reinforced by a nervous system that's stuck in survival mode. So that leads me on to, what do you do when you feel like you don't have a choice? How can you start to shift this belief and this feeling that you have to be doing stuff for others and you can't do what you need or want to do? So the first step, as always, is increasing your awareness. So if you struggle to recognize when you're being driven by an ingrained sense of obligation, the first step is increasing your awareness. This awareness might come after the event or it might come during it, but the key is to just start noticing and observing with curiosity what's going on. Pay attention to how your body feels in those moments. Are there physical cues that signal you're doing something you don't really want to be doing? You know, you're saying yes, but in your stomach, or you're feeling all nervous and pent up. Begin the curiosity, the observing. What patterns or triggers can you identify that will help you start spotting these moments earlier so you can catch them more easily? And once you start noticing those cues, perhaps it's a feeling of being trapped or it's feeling being pressured, just pause and check in with yourself and ask yourself, what am I feeling right now? Where do I feel it in my body? Is it a guilt feeling, fear? Is it anxious? Is it anxiety? Is it the sense of not wanting to let someone down? Is it a feeling of fear of conflict? Naming the emotion and noticing what you feel in the body helps you become more in tune with these signals. And acknowledging it also allows you to create some distance, to step back from it and observe it for what it is, rather than feeling as intensely the feeling like that you're it. You're noticing, I am feeling this way. I am noticing this, rather than I am this. And then once you've started to recognize what's happening when it's happening, remind yourself that the feeling of having no choice is just that. It's a feeling and not a fact. And I know it's easier said than done, but just remind yourself of that. While there may be rare exceptions, in most situations, the belief that you must comply is not a true reflection of reality. So ask yourself, what would I do if I believed that I had options here? Even if you don't feel like you have a choice, just ask yourself, what would I do if I believed I did have options and there was alternatives to this? And what's the worst that could happen if I did something different? What would I say to a friend or a loved one in this situation if they were feeling this way? And that in itself can just help you sort of start taking a bit more of an outside perspective on it. And then take a moment to reflect for yourself. Where does this feeling come from? What does it remind me of? Like me in that driving example, it wasn't until I sort of closed my eyes and like really just, I know it sounds daft, but sort of asking my body like, oh, what might I be remembering here? Well, noticing those feelings, what do they remind me of? And then those images popped in because I was sort of using how I was feeling to draw out those implicit memories, drawing them into my conscious awareness. And then I was like, oh yeah, no wonder I feel this disproportionate level of anxiety when it's snowing or when it has snowed and the roads are starting to clear, because I'm still being reminded of those times, those bad experiences of being in those moments with the snow. And in terms of for yourself, these times where you feel like, have no choice and you're being pressured and feeling trapped, just ask yourself, reflect. When or where did I learn that I had limited choices and I had to comply? Does this moment remind you of a specific childhood experience or a past pattern or a person? And recognizing the roots of these feelings can help you understand why this situation feels so intense. It allows you to distinguish between then and there versus here and now, helping you see the differences between the past experiences and your current reality. Like my snow example, I could start noticing, oh, no wonder, like it's what's going on underneath the surface for me. It's that my nervous system is remembering how I felt back in the day when I felt like I had no choice and I had to drive in those snowy conditions. So by becoming aware of that, it allowed me then to remind myself that no, I'm an adult. I do have a choice. I can, within reason, do what I want. I have autonomy. I have the confidence to make a decision for me. So you can just start seeing the differences between the past stuff and your current reality and gaining perspective on it. And then when you recognize the moments when you do have an option, allow yourself to imagine if there were no bad consequences for whatever choice you made, everyone was fine about it, nothing bad happened, no one fell out with you. Ask yourself, what would you choose to do in those moments? And then start practicing making choices that prioritize you. Now, depending on the situation and the choice you're making, obviously, what you can then do in practice in terms of what you might say to someone or your behaviour is going to look different, isn't it, for different things? And it might just be, in terms of everyday examples, it could be just practicing making a choice for you based on like a preference of when someone offers you a drink that you don't like or offers you, a cake that you don't want, just tuning into what you want to do. And rather than you feeling like you've got to force it down you or you've got to accept it, just reminding yourself in that moment that actually I am an adult. I'm not a child who's got to comply with what's being, imposed on them. Oh, actually, yeah, I'm not really keen on that, but thank you so much for thinking of me. Or, oh, I'm not really a fan of tea. I'd really love a coffee though instead. You don't have to start with massive things is what I'm saying. Just start small and start tweaking your responses here and there wherever you can in itself will just help start sort of rewiring your brain, if you like, and start forming some new neural pathways that will help you respond differently in the future. Now, since these patterns that we're talking about are so tied to survival responses a lot of the time, regulating your nervous system is crucial. That could look like using grounding exercises or deep breathing techniques, depending on how you find breathing techniques, because for some people they can be quite triggering. But simply stepping away for a moment to calm your body before responding can be helpful. So implementing a pause and stepping away and thinking about it and tuning into how you're feeling. And if you do feel sort of like shaky or sick at the thought of like having to tell someone you can't do something or making a different choice to what you feel like someone wants you to make, as I say, grounding techniques can be really helpful. So just looking around, like really tuning into what you can see, what you can hear, what you can smell, maybe what you can taste or touch, just trying to refocus and just looking around just to feel your body settling a little bit. And it's not a magical cure to stop you feeling anxious, but it can just help take the edge off it a bit. Some people find breathing exercises helpful. Now, with breathing exercises, I would say if you try them and they're not for you, you're not failing. You don't have to keep trying to get them right, breathe in for 4 and out for 6 or box breathing and all that. For some people, breathing exercises can actually be quite triggering. If concentrating on your breathing and focusing in on it actually makes you worse, there's nothing wrong with you. It's just that for some people, it does make it worse and it might not be for you. There might be other techniques that will be more helpful to you. And also just remind yourselves in those moments, if you're feeling that discomfort, it's not that you're doing something wrong. It just means you're doing something different. So your nervous system resists change because it prefers what's familiar, even if the familiar thing isn't the best thing for you. But with practice as well, it will get easier. And by exposing yourself to the unfamiliar, the thing that brings you discomfort, the more you'll be able to increase your tolerance to it. And then in effect, you'll reduce the intensity of that discomfort as you keep practicing it. It's not about failing in any way or being weak because you're feeling this way. These patterns exist for a reason. When you first learned to comply and to do as you're told, it brought with it a feeling of safety for you. They were quite ingenious strategies, really, to help you feel calmer and to feel more safe in the environments that you grew up in a lot of the time. But now you have the opportunity to learn a new way of being. So if you do feel really bad for making a different choice, just allow yourself to remind yourself, what would I say to a friend feeling this way? You'd probably say to them, it's okay to choose you right now. It's not being selfish. It's actually really healthy to make a choice for you rather than to always comply with what everyone else wants you to do. And notice the tone of voice as well that you're using when you are beating yourself up for perhaps telling someone that you can't do something or you don't want to do something. And if you're listening to this and you're thinking, yeah, I get it, I get what I need to do, I get all the points. And you understand what you need to do, but in the moment, it all feels impossible and it feels too much. There's a reason for that. The past messages and the conditioning you've been exposed to can hold you back from feeling able to implement those changes. Even if you get it, doesn't mean that you're going to feel able to implement it. And there might be something deeper that needs exploring and addressing. And that's where my approach comes in. I work with you to identify and process what's really holding you back, while also teaching you practical, evidence-based strategies so you can move forward. Now, you may or may not be familiar with the concept of neuroplasticity, your brain's ability to change. But every time you challenge the belief that you don't have a choice and you start feeling like you do have a choice, you're forming new neural pathways. You're literally rewiring your brain to see new possibilities in front of you. Now, it takes practice, but over time, these small shifts that you can implement every day can lead to big changes. So if you've ever felt trapped by the belief or the feeling like you have to say yes, or that you don't have a choice, I really hope this episode's just been helpful in terms of helping you start to see that there is another way. Change is possible. And undoing years of conditioning isn't easy, but it is possible. I'm proof of that, and so are the people that I've worked with over the years. With practice, patience, and the right support, you can learn to show up for yourself in ways that feel good and feel aligned with who you really are. So thank you so much for listening and for spending this time with me today. And if this resonated, I'd love for you to share it with someone who might need to hear it as well, because just to give people hope. And if you want more support and you want to finally take that step towards knowing and feeling that you have a choice and feeling able to implement boundaries, then please do reach out. I would love to support you on this journey. I still offer a free initial call where you can chat to me about my approach and my framework that I've developed to help you break free from these people-pleasing patterns so you can embrace your authentic self unapologetically. But for now, thank you so much, and I'll see you soon.